Kurt Leuschner. He's a professor of natural resources at College of the Desert, where he teaches courses on conservation, entomology, field ornithology, native plants, and GPS navigation. Leuschner also teaches weekend courses and workshops on birdwatching, insects, GPS, and backyard habitats for UCR Extension, the Desert Institute, the Desert Studies Center, and the Living Desert. And he is perennially one of our most popular speakers. So please help me welcome Kurt Leuschner.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? So thanks for coming out and supporting the Rancho Mirage Library. A few commercial announcements. I did bring some Condor books, which you can look at afterwards if you're interested. There's also a flyer here that has my contact info, so if you want to take that, you can contact me if you have any follow-up questions. Included with your price of admission today, you get a lifetime of free consulting from me. Just send me an email and I'll try to answer all of your bird and bug and desert ecology kind of questions. If you call the college, they funnel those phone calls to me anyway, so they come straight to me. And I shouldn't tell you this, but this Friday I'm leading the Sunnylands Bird Walk here in Rancho Mirage. If you all show up, I'm in trouble. Or maybe they'll like that, I don't know. But anyway, it's this Friday at 8:45 and it's free and it's 1 hour. So we do a nice little walk around the gardens and look for birds and talk about other stuff too, like plants. So that's this Friday. And so I'm also the head of the Desert Cities Bird Club. I know a lot of you are probably on the list already, but if you'd like to join our club and be on our email list, I just need your name and your email address, and there's a little form you can fill out here for that. Or just email me later today and say, hey, Kurt, I want to be on the list, and I'll add you. And if you do, then you'll get our newsletter emailed to you 3 times a year, which tells you about all the birding and nature activities in and around the Coachella Valley, keep you informed. A lot of them are free. And you'll also get occasional emails from me about some kind of a bird announcement here and there. And our editor, Robin, is here in the back today, too, so thanks for coming, Robin. But today I'm here to talk about condors. And I've been watching condors since the 70s when I was a little kid. And here's evidence of that. My dad used to take me to the Condor Watch and Tequila Bust. So here's my shirt. This one's from 1980, but I was going even before that. So I was there for the condors. Maybe my dad was there for the tequila, but there it is. So that's when condors were still wild before they captured them all. So we'll get into that in just a minute. So condors look like this, and this is how you classify a condor. Of course, they're a type of bird, and they're in the family Cathartidae, and they're the only surviving member of their genus at this time. There were a couple others, but they went extinct before the Ice Age. So turkey vultures are in the same family. And turkey vultures are passing through town right now, so look up and you might see one. We'll talk a little bit about vultures in general. So condors and vultures kind of go together. They're in that same family, Cathartidae, and they typically have no feathers on their heads because of their lifestyle of sticking their heads in juicy carcasses. It makes it a lot easier for them to clean up. They don't make any sounds, and so when you see a turkey vulture on TV or in the movies, they're always dubbing a red-tailed hawk onto it, because they don't actually make any sounds. So you'll typically hear something like this, which is actually a red-tailed hawk sound, not a condor or a turkey vulture. So here in the New World, that's the Americas, we have 7 species of vulture: South America, Central America, North America. 3 of them are in our neck of the woods, you might say. And then, of course, in the old world, Asia, Africa, and Europe, you've got a whole other set of vultures over there. They're in a different family. So those are the old world vultures. These are the new world vultures. One of these new world vultures that's here in the U.S. Is the black vulture. So if you're from the south, you know this bird. They're pretty common in the southeast, Florida, Georgia, parts of Texas, etc. They range all the way over to Arizona, but not into California. They're a little smaller than the turkey vultures, and they have white on the ends of the wings. So that's the black vulture. Turkey vultures, as I mentioned, are migrating through right now, heading north, and they can live quite long, these vultures, up to 50 years or so. Condors can sometimes live to 60 years. And they can fly really high if they want to, but they prefer to fly about 5,000 feet or less. So it kind of depends on the terrain, what they got to get over. So soaring birds like these vultures, which includes condors, they've got what's called a low aspect ratio. And that means they're not super fast flyers, but they get a lot of good uplift. And that's what you want. An albatross has a low aspect ratio, so they're really fast and cut through the air much differently than a condor, but they don't get that lift that a condor or a vulture would get. So different kind of wing loading there. And also, vultures have what's called a low wing loading. So this is when you compare the size and the weight of the body to the size of the wings. And this also gets them really good updraft. Now, a bird with a high wing loading would be an ostrich. He's pretty heavy, as you know, and his wings aren't going to lift him very high. So that's high wing loading, keeps you on the ground. Low wing loading allows you to lift off like a turkey vulture or a condor. Here's a fun fact for you. So members of the vulture family, which includes condors, are known to pee on their own legs to keep cool. So it's a good desert survival tip for you here. Just in case. So, as you know, vultures eat carrion, dead stuff, and they're not raptors, technically. Raptors are birds of prey who actually capture live prey and subdue it and then eat it. Condors don't do that. They're eating carrion, and vultures as well. The bigger the condor, then the bigger the prey, typically. So condors like to eat deer, but they'll eat smaller stuff as well. Turkey vultures eat a lot of roadkill, including this armadillo on the side of the road, probably in Texas. And the word vulture actually means terror in Latin. They tear open their prey, just like you see there. That's a turkey vulture. So some vultures have a really good sense of smell. And this includes the turkey vulture and the condors. But the black vulture that I showed you earlier does not have a good sense of smell, so it cheats. It follows the turkey vultures, lets them smell the carrion, and then follows them and goes where they go. These vultures also have some pretty amazing enzymes in their body that allow them to kill salmonella and other harmful bacteria that would definitely do us in if we ate it. And that's why they can eat roadkill and we shouldn't. Did you see, though, they're gonna pass a law, and California is going to be one of those states now that's going to allow you to collect roadkill and eat it. So watch for that. But right now you can't. You can't pick it up, so don't do it. You need a permit. I do have a permit to pick up roadkill, so I can actually legally pick it up. This is my son Drake, actually, at the Phoenix Zoo, posing for you. Just giving you some idea how big these condors are, 10 feet. And they're also the heaviest birds around at 29 pounds. So huge birds, huge wingspan, can live up to 60 years, but 40 is more typical if they don't get into trouble. They can fly pretty fast when they're soaring, up to 75 miles an hour. Now, that's not flapping their wings. That's just, a really fast kind of a glide. And as I mentioned before, they can go to 15, 20,000 feet, but they prefer to fly low because they have a better chance of spotting their prey and smelling the carrion. Where do they nest? Cliff ledges are preferred, such as this one. Sometimes they'll use a tree like this giant sequoia. Typical nest looks like this. It's not much. It's just a shallow scrape in the ground, just enough to hopefully keep the egg from rolling off the ledge, although they sometimes do roll off the ledge. And one egg, that's it. It's a big egg. So they lay one egg every 2 years. So they can't even lay one egg a year. So it's a very low fertility rate. These are some young condors just hatched. So when the condors are young, they have a darker head. So that's one way to tell. It's a bird that's in its first few years. It takes them up to 7 years sometimes to reach full maturity. And the head will get lighter and more red in color. So here's a historic range of the condors. You can see they used to occur all the way up to Canada along the Pacific coast. And there was another subpopulation in Florida and even a small little population in New England. I don't know what's going on there. I'd like to find out about that. But that's where they used to be. And then, of course, that range contracted after the Ice Age. If you go to the Page Museum in Los Angeles, next to the La Brea tar pits, I highly recommend that. There's a lot of good information about some of these condors that aren't around anymore, the other species. But they have a lot of the bones of them. And they were even bigger than our California condor. So that's just a neat place to visit. So plan a day trip to go out to the Page Museum and see the tar pits. Lewis and Clark also encountered condors. So they were still in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1800s. And they saw them. By 1930, though, they were gone from those areas, and they were only in California after 1930. John James Audubon was painting condors back in the 1800s on the left there, and Joseph Grinnell at UC Berkeley was already using the condor as a symbol of disappearing wilderness as early as 1904. So they already were in severe decline even back then. Why were they declining? Egg collectors. Egg collecting was a big deal, with eggs going for as much as $300. That was a lot of money 100 years ago. Miners were using condor feathers, as you'll see in just a moment. Accidental poisoning has always been a big problem. You know, poison carcasses meant to kill coyotes and things like that. Condors also would succumb. By 1982, there was only 22 birds left in the wild, plus a couple in zoos. So we really thought that was the end in 82. DDT was another problem. Fortunately, that was banned in 1972, thanks to Rachel Carson and her book, Silent Spring. But that also led to the demise of many condors. Condors live in Chumash Indian country, so they've always been writing about them in their rock art and revering the condor. And as I mentioned, these quills from condors were used by miners to carry their gold dust. They could put a cork on the end of it and fill that up with gold dust, and that was something they did, and they'd carry it around their neck. So that was the way to go back then, but not good for condors. So here's one of those places we went in the 70s and the 80s, and people still go. It's called The Sign, so condor watchers know this as The Sign, but it's this place on the side of the road where the Leaving Los Padres National Forest sign is, and you park there, and you got a great view of the valley below, and it's a good place to see condors. This is north of Los Angeles. I'll show you a map in just a moment. Oops. So here's some more people lining up near the sign watching condors up in the mountains behind Mount Pinus. I might even be in that picture somewhere. That's one of those tequila bust things. So they watch condors by day and I guess drink tequila at night. But so vultures are headed to Hinckley, Ohio right now for the Vulture Festival, which is just a few days from now, March 16th. So head on up there. But when you see these vultures flying by, this is where they're going. And they're anxiously awaiting them up in Hinckley. And just like the swallows coming back to Capistrano, the vultures come back to Hinckley every year right on time. And this really does happen, by the way. And so they have a buzzard scoreboard there, and they keep track of the daily sightings. It's a lot of fun. Here's some people enjoying the festival. eBird, by the way, if you don't know about that website, you should. It's the best place to report your bird sightings. It's real easy. You can set up a free account, and you can store all of your bird sightings and report them and share them with the world on a daily basis. So check it out. It's called ebird.org. So back to the condors. So in the 80s, when things weren't looking good for the condors, they decided to try to help increase their fertility. And they discovered that even though they only lay one egg usually every 2 years, if that egg is stolen or lost, that they would lay a second one to make up for it if you take it at the right time. So they would actually scale down the cliffs, steal the egg from the condor nest, and then the condor would lay a second egg. And then the first egg that they stole, they would take to the San Diego Wild Animal Park or to the LA Zoo and then raise it in captivity so they could double the clutch size. You get one raised in the wild and one raised in captivity. So they were doing this for a while in the early 80s and successfully raised, I don't know, a couple dozen condors at least in this way. So here's a little condor chick. It takes about 2 months for those eggs to hatch. And so this is one of those condors that could be raised in captivity while the parents were busy raising a second one in the wild. This is how you catch a wild condor, an adult condor. You use something called a cannon net. So you kind of hide this net in the grass, and you put some bait nearby, like a dead calf or some kind of carrion. And then when the condor lands to feed on the carcass, you shoot the cannon net out over the condor and catch it. And if you do it right, it doesn't injure the condor, and you can just subdue it and grab it and carefully extract it from the net. And that's one way you can take blood samples. You can't tell the males from females without taking a blood sample. So they would take blood samples, determine the sex of the bird, check for lead poisoning, put tags and markers on all these birds so they could then identify them in the field without having to catch them each time. So this was AC9. He was the last remaining wild condor, finally captured in 1987. So with the capture of AC9 in 1987, there were no more wild condors. They were all in zoos at that point. And he actually returned to the wild in 2002, so that was kind of a fun story. He was in captivity for 15 years, and then he returned to the wild again. But these birds they decided to capture all the remaining wild condors, and as you saw, the last one was captured in 1987, and most of them went to this place in San Diego called the Condominium. Well, that's what they call it. And it's in the San Diego Wild Animal Park, which is now called the San Diego Zoo Safari Park or something. What is it? Okay, well, whatever. It's got a new name, but most of us know it as the Wild Animal Park. And the condor breeding facility is still down there, the Condominium. And so they didn't know. This is why it was such a big risk to capture all those remaining condors and try to breed them in captivity. They didn't know if they would breed in captivity. They really didn't know. And luckily, the answer was yes. And and because they captured them all, they didn't really have a choice. So they did breed in captivity, and so they were able to raise the young in captivity. And again, they could steal the egg and get them to lay a second one, so they were speeding things up a little bit and raising these birds in captivity. But it's super important to avoid imprinting. And so you need these little puppets like I have in my hand here. Got a little show and tell for you. But this is one of those puppets that you see there that they use to feed the baby condors, and they hide behind a curtain and do a little puppet show for the condors. And this way the condor doesn't see the human face or associate with humans at all. It thinks it's associated with an actual condor. And this is super important for certain birds like condors that are subject to imprinting. During those first few days, and especially those first few weeks or even months of their existence, they really lock on to whatever's feeding them. And so if it's a human form, they're going to continue to think that they're human for the rest of their lives and always go to humans. And if you trick them into thinking condors feeding them, then they will associate with condors in the future. So these puppets are super important to have. And so you're probably wondering how I got this puppet. Well, I got connections. So I was actually showing a little condor video in the conservation class I teach at College of the Desert one day. This was probably 15 years ago. And one of the gals in the class said, my sister's the one who makes those puppets. And so I said, see me after class. And so I got her sister's number and called her up, and she agreed to make a puppet for us too, which was really cool. And it turns out she makes other puppets too. She does peregrine falcons and loggerhead shrikes and whooping cranes and bald eagles and all these birds that need puppets to help prevent imprinting. She does that. So they raised a bunch of condors in captivity using the puppets, preventing the imprinting, doubling the clutch size, and eventually in 1992, they were ready to start releasing some of those condors into the wild. So that was another big moment in this condor recovery program. The San Diego Zoo, as I mentioned, was the main partner, or the Wild Animal Park. LA Zoo played a role in this, and also in Idaho, the World Center for the Birds of Prey in Boise also had a hand in some of this as well. So condors fare better in groups, and so they released Andean condors along with the California condors to boost their numbers and give them a better chance for survival in the wild. Because they're social birds, and they like to hang out with other condors, and they didn't have enough condors, California condors, to release, so they boosted the number with some Andean condors, which were easier to obtain. And eventually they would bring the Andean condors back in and just have the Californias out in the wild. But initially, you'd see Andean condors flying around with the Californias. Now, where were they releasing these first condors? Well, it was just north of LA, as I mentioned, in this place called Bitter Creek National Wildlife Refuge in the Sespe Wilderness. A lot of these areas are off limits to the public even today, so you have to have special permission to get in there. But they've preserved and set aside some large tracts of land there for the condor recovery program. This is just off the 5 freeway as you're driving up towards Bakersfield on the left. So here's a map. Some of you may know Six Flags Magic Mountain, but it's just north of that. Just beyond that is where we're talking about, where it says Sespe Wilderness there. Right there. So here's the Interstate 5. Here's Frazier Park. Here's Mount Pinus, where the Condor Watch and Tequila Bust is somewhere around here. So this is all condor country. And these are some of the release sites. So after the initial release in this area, this is still the main core of the population. They didn't want to put all their eggs in one basket, you might say. And so they wanted to have other populations in other places just in case something happened to the main population, like disease or some other catastrophe. So they started to establish populations. The next one was over in Arizona, and this is near the Grand Canyon, a place called Vermillion Cliffs at the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And so that's a place you can go to see condors today. Some of those condors from the Grand Canyon group are now ranging up into Utah, into Zion. So Zion National Park, the Kaibabs section, is another place you can go to see condors. And then they also established another population up here near Big Sur along Highway 1 on the Ventana Wilderness. And these are the ones that occur on the beach here. So as you're driving up Route 1 to Monterey, you can look down on the beach and see condors sometimes. And some of these birds are now mixing with some of these birds. That's why this green blob is now connected to that green blob. But originally, these were separate populations. So now they're flying back and forth sometimes, which is nice to see. And now a fourth population has been established down in Mexico. So for the first time, I think I have a slide about this coming up, but the first time in a long time, condors are flying free in Mexico again. And at least one of those birds flew over the wall and, well, the wall's not designed to stop condors, so it flew over the wall, took a few laps around San Diego, and then flew back to Mexico. So that's what this green blob represents. So one of these days, one of these Mexican birds is probably going to come over here to the Coachella Valley and maybe do a few circles around Rancho Mirage. Wouldn't that be fun? So anyway, there's 4 separate populations now that are being established, which is really good. But they fly so far that they can start to mix, and that's part of the hope that they might. So they have some goals, of course, for this program. They want to have at least 150 birds in both California and Arizona populations, and also the Mexican one as well, with at least 15 breeding pairs each by 2020, which is next year. So they're getting close to reaching those goals. They're probably not going to quite reach those goals, but it's good to have goals, and they'll reset them and continue on. This is just a checkup day at Bitter Creek. They catch these birds and give them checkups and then release them. So today in 2019, there's almost 500 birds. There might be a few more than 500, but they're right around 500 California condors in existence right now, which is really good compared to the 22 that we were down to in 1982. And at least 200 of those, about half, are in the wild, in those 4 populations I just described. And the other half, of course, are still in the condominium or at Boise, Idaho, waiting to be released or just part of the captive breeding program to keep the eggs coming. So things are looking much better for the condors. They're still endangered, but the numbers are looking really good now. And you can have a really good chance of seeing one. If you go to one of those places I just told you about, there's a really good chance of seeing condors. Probably the easiest place to see them of all is the Grand Canyon, the south rim of the Grand Canyon, where all the tourists go. So just go there and enjoy the view of the canyon, which you should do anyway, and then ask the ranger where the condors are, and they'll probably say, over there on the wall, and there's one sitting right there. You know, they're just right there by the Bright Angel Lodge. These are some folks up at Vermillion Cliffs. Again, giving a condor a little checkup before it's going to be released into the wild. Last year, 2018, was the year of the bird, and the condor was on the cover of Audubon magazine. These are the tags that they put on all the condors that are released, so they all have their own number, so they can be properly identified at a distance, so they don't have to recapture them too often. Patagial tags, they're called. And they track them using telemetry and GPS, because these condors are fitted with transmitters. Here's a condor in the Grand Canyon. And as I mentioned, some of those Grand Canyon birds have discovered Zion National Park, another beautiful park to visit in Utah. And some of them you'll see over the beach, again, near Big Sur, right near Pfeiffer, Big Sur State Park on Route 1. Look up on the cliffs, look up overhead, and look down on the beaches, and you might see condors feeding on a whale or a dead sea lion like these, right on the California coast. So that's probably the second easiest place to see condors, is taking Route 1 up to the Big Sur area. In Mexico, they were last seen in 1937, and in 2002, they started releasing condors in Mexico. And in 2007, that was another landmark. The Mexican birds laid their first egg in the wild. So all of these, all this progress is being made. So the question is, will condors reach our area anytime soon, including Joshua Tree National Park. One of those birds from the LA group, from the Sespe Wilderness, actually made it as far as Big Bear in the San Bernardino Mountains, which isn't too far away from here. So if it just overshot Big Bear a little bit more, it could make it over to Joshua Tree or Yucca Valley. So it's going to happen one of these days. We're going to see a condor in this area. They need a lot of room to survive, and so habitat loss, of course, is a major reason that they're not doing as well as they used to. They also get electrocuted on power lines. Condors are big enough birds that they can outstretch their wings and touch two different wires at the same time, which electrocutes them. If a bird just perches on a single wire, it's grounded. So smaller birds don't have to worry about this, but the larger birds who have long wingspans do have to worry a lot about electrocution. So they do training while they're in captivity. They train them to not want to sit on these power poles. They'll put a couple of fake power poles in the enclosure, and every time they land on it, they get a little shock, just enough to make them want to leave. And so the idea is once they release them in the wild, they're going to just stay away from anything that looks like a power pole. So that helps. Meanwhile, we got other things going up into their airspace, like cell phone towers and wind turbines. And, you know, as much as I'm a fan of alternative energy, I'm not in support of putting wind turbines everywhere we possibly can. We have to do that very carefully. So there's ways that they can place these turbines in certain areas that won't affect birds of prey as much. There are special devices they can put on wind turbines that will actually shut them off. If a condor approaches too close, it will sense that. It will shut off, and then as the condor passes, it will turn on again. So the technology exists to really help this problem, but it costs money, and somebody has to pay for it. And so unless the state or the federal government requires these things, then the companies who do the wind turbines aren't necessarily going to install all of this great technology. So we have to do this wind very carefully as we expand that energy. Probably the main culprit, though, over the years has been lead poisoning. I think more condors have died of lead poisoning than any other one of these issues. And that's because they feed on dead deer and things like that, and those are shot using lead bullets. And so even a few tiny fragments of lead from that bullet is enough to kill a condor and give it blood poisoning. And of course, they ingest this as they're eating the carcasses that are left behind. So either a hunter isn't able to retrieve what he shot, or they just take part of the animal and leave behind the entrails and other pieces which are still full of lead, and when wildlife eat those, it's a big problem. And so switching to non-lead shot is one of the easiest solutions, and I'll get to that in a second. Here's another issue. Birds of prey normally swallow small stones and things like that to aid with their digestion. But in the wild now, they're finding a lot of our trash, what's called microtrash. So this is stuff taken out of a condor's crop. And you can see glass and bullet shells and all kinds of plastics. So they're picking up a lot of trash, thinking it's a little rock or pebble that's going to help them, and it doesn't. And this can, of course, clog up their whole system or give them some kind of a poisoning from the chemicals that leach out of these things. So in 2008, Governor Schwarzenegger signed a law which banned lead ammunition in condor country. Now, originally, they were trying to ban it statewide, but they couldn't get that vote. So they kind of compromised, and they were able to at least ban lead ammunition in the main areas where the condors occur. So that was a start. The next step, of course, is training hunters to respect the ban and to use alternative types of ammunition. In just this past year, Governor Brown, who you see on the right there, that's his official portrait, signed into law a statewide ban. So we finally got the statewide ban here in California to ban lead ammunition. So this is being phased in, and so hunters are going to have to get used to shooting something other than lead. And we can do it. We can adjust. They were able to adjust with non-ivory piano keys, and I think piano music sounds just as fine these days, although there was a lot of objections to that initially too. So this is another one of those things we can get used to. We can get used to copper bullets or steel shot, but not lead. So, we hope to entice other states to do the same. These are some laws that help protect condors that maybe you've heard of, starting with the Lacey Act in 1900, and more recently the Endangered Species Act of 1973. The condor is an umbrella species, so that means if we protect habitat for the condor, we'll be protecting a lot of other species at the same time, which will get the sort of that umbrella protection of the condor. So it's not just about protecting condors and their habitat. There's a lot of other benefits to setting aside some of these lands. You can also go there and hike and enjoy them as well. Here's a condor model. And here's some condor stamps. I collect stamps that have birds on them, so these are some of the ones that I've seen with condors on them. Some of these are Andean condors. You got to go down to Peru or Ecuador to see those. And these are a few of the resources that you might see on display up here, and a few more. And the condor's even on our state quarter. You might have a picture of it in your pocket right now, flying next to John Muir. It ought to be our state bird, right? But we got the quail. So these are some of the resources used. And these are some of the agencies that are helping to support condors. And that is the end, but not the end of the condor, right? Any questions? Did the fires affect the condors? Not that I heard of. Yeah, not that I heard of. Yeah. Can condors hear? Yeah, they have a good sense of hearing. Most birds do. Do they communicate? They don't really make much sound. So there isn't a lot of verbal communication going on, no. Yeah. To what age can the females lay eggs? That's a good question. I don't know, actually. But if they can live 50 to 60 years, I bet she can lay eggs for most of that time. I don't know if there's an actual cutoff, but I think at least 40 years, yeah. How much of the research is nonprofit supported? Well, some of the money through the Endangered Species Act is coming from your tax dollars. So that funds the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I'd say the bulk of it probably comes through that. And then there's some nonprofit monies coming in, but not a whole lot. So anyway, there was a sighting of a condor in Los Alamos, New Mexico. So I guess we'll have to add a green blob to one of my slides, right? But that's good to know. Thanks. Do they get sunburn on their bald head? I'm trying, I don't know. I haven't heard of that being a problem, so they probably got some extra thick skin or something going on up there to protect them. There are a few little small kind of hairs on their head. They're not hairs, they're feathers, but small little micro feathers, so maybe that helps diffuse the sun. Yeah, that's a good question, though. Yeah, in the back? Yeah, right there. Okay, so, but remember, the imprinting only happens in those first few weeks or a couple of months. Okay, so that's when it's important to use the puppets. After that, it doesn't matter as much or at all. So they can have humans walking around and feeding them. They still minimize the contact with them, but it doesn't matter then if they see a human figure after that point. They're wild enough now because they got through that early stage. Yeah. Do they get aggressive with people? Not so much. They're pretty docile when they're handling them. You still have to be careful, though. Keep an eye on their beak, but they actually kind of almost go into a trance when they capture them, and they just sort of go limp and let you handle them. Are there any natural predators to condors? When they're on the ground, that's when they're most vulnerable. So I guess a coyote or something like that could try to grab one, but that would be tough even for a coyote to get. So I guess a mountain lion or something could snatch one, but for the most part, no, they don't have to worry about that. Predators, yeah.
How long is the mating partnership, and does the male help with the process of bringing up the eggs?
Yeah, you could say they mate for life kind of thing. So they tend to stick together with their partner, and the male does help. They take shifts on the nest. So she sits on him, he flies around, gets food, he comes back, so they do shifts. I don't know if it's quite 50-50, but maybe 60-40 in favor of the female. Yeah. How often do they have to eat? They'd love to probably eat every day if they could, but in tough times, they can probably go many weeks without a meal, although that's not preferred. So if they can get one decent meal a week, they're doing pretty good. Yeah.
The condors that are in the Pinnacles Park south of Gilroy, is that part of the Big Sur?
Yeah, that's part of that Big Sur complex, Ventana Wilderness, Pinnacles National Monument or Park. Yeah.
Many condors in that park?
I don't know how many are in that subpopulation, but there's probably, 50 or 60 of them at least in that group.
Are they artificially fed in any way?
Are they artificially, like the ones in the wild?
Yeah.
So when they release the condors into the wild for a while, they do put out food for them until they can figure out how to feed on their own. So that could go on for many months. And then they kind of wean them off. And then eventually they're on their own. But yeah, they do have feeding stations and they do maintain those. So in case a condor is lazy or it's just not finding food on its own, it can come back and get a little something to eat. So they're trying to help them out, yes. Way in the back?
Have there been any genetic complications due to having such a small breeding population?
Are there any genetic problems since they got down to under 30 birds? Anytime you get that low in a population, there's always a risk of losing important genetic diversity. But in this case, they didn't have a choice. So far, things seem to be working okay, and nothing crucial seems to have been lost, but time will tell, I guess. But it's never a good idea to let a population get that low, that's for sure. Yeah, in the back? The Andean condor is the other one, and they're doing better in terms of numbers and range. I don't know if they're technically endangered or not, but they're definitely threatened and declining, and so I'm sure they can use some of the techniques here and apply them to Andean condors, and they do. Yes? They have to put one tag on each wing to kind of balance things out, right? And so they have this little screw latch thing, and they poke it through the feathers, the base of the feathers, and attach it to the main wing bone there. And it's hooked on really tightly, and there's just a little kind of a heavy plastic tag with a number that. So it doesn't weigh very much at all, so it doesn't really weigh them down, and it's not getting in the way of any important flight feathers. So they just put it in an out-of-the-way place, kind of on their arm there, and it seems to work, and it's balanced. And So if they're doing radio telemetry, they sometimes have a little harness or kind of a backpacky thing that kind of goes around the chest and a little whip antenna on the back that's kind of tucked into the feathers. So again, it doesn't interfere with flight. The condor hopefully doesn't even notice it's there. It weighs almost nothing. But that's how they can track it with radio telemetry. Now they're getting better. They can actually surgically implant like little low jack transmitters. But that involves putting the condor or the bird under anesthesia for quite some time, doing an actual surgery. But that's what's coming in the future, more of that kind of thing, where you're actually implanting something internally. Yeah.
The turkey vultures that are migrating, where are they coming from?
Well, the turkey vultures, most of them winter south of the border, so they go down to Mexico or Central America, for the most part, Panama, Costa Rica, those areas. And then this time of the year, they're one of the earliest migrants, so starting in January, they're already starting to head north. And they're not all going to Hinckley, Ohio, okay? I like to think that, but they're just heading north. Some of them are going to go straight up to Canada, some are going to stop short, and so they're going to spread out throughout the western United States, wherever they can find carrion. We don't get a lot of them staying here in the summer. Maybe it's too hot. There's probably plenty of roadkill. We got a lot of roads and cars, but most of them are heading north a little bit or more. Yes? The question is, how do condors take off? Can they just jump up and fly? And the answer, that's a good question, and the answer is no, they can't just jump up and fly. They need a little bit of a run. So it's usually a flap, 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 and run 3 or 4 steps, and then they need a little bit of a run up, but not a lot. I don't know the question is the second egg in a double clutch as healthy as the first? Because it takes a lot of energy. I want to say the answer is yes. At least I haven't heard anything to the contrary, that the second chick is somehow weaker or, anything. So I think the condor mother has, enough energy in her to produce 2 eggs if she needs to. To produce a third, no, that's not going to happen. I think on one of the slides it said 2 months to hatch. From the first time it's laid to hatching, 2 months, yeah. The question is, if the egg rolls off the cliff, thank you for coming. No, I'm just saying goodbye to those folks. If the egg rolls off the cliff, will she lay a second one? Or does it have to be actually stolen? That's a good question. If it rolls off the cliff, yes, she will lay another one. She'll realize the egg is gone, it doesn't matter why, and then she'll lay another one. In most cases. She may have to think about it for a while and try to figure out what happened. Yeah. Okay, one more question, and then I'll be here to answer all the rest, too. Yeah. So AC9 was that famous bird. He was the last of the wild condors who was later re-released in 2002. I thought I just read that he passed away this past year. Maybe somebody saw that article too. So I think he just recently finally succumbed. Yeah, AC9, the most famous condor of all. Anyway, I thank you for coming, and I'm here, so come on up and talk some more.